August 15th, 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The morning sun filters through the mesh windows of Barracks 7, casting geometric shadows across rows of neatly arranged cots. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka sits motionless on the edge of his bunk, staring at an empty K ration box in his weathered hands. The cardboard bears the familiar black lettering, U.S. Army Field Ration K, Breakfast Unit. For 32 days, this brown rectangle has been his daily companion. 32 days since the destroyer Akizuki took her final dive beneath the waves of Leyte Gulf. 32 days since he learned that surrender did not mean death, but something far more unsettling: abundance. The breakfast bell echoes across the compound. Around him, fellow prisoners of war rise with mechanical precision, their faces carrying the same bewildered expression that has become commonplace here. They file toward the mess hall, where American guards will hand them another K ration, another impossible contradiction to everything they were taught to believe about their enemy. Tanaka runs his thumb across the cardboard's edge. Inside this simple box lay chopped ham and eggs, coffee that was actually coffee, sugar that was real sugar, and chocolate that tasted of prosperity rather than desperation. Yesterday he had gained another pound. The camp doctor said most of them had, from 1,200 calories of rice and hope to 2,830 calories of American industrial might, delivered 3 times daily with casual efficiency. He stands slowly, the K ration box still cradled in his palms. Somewhere across the Pacific, Emperor Hirohito had just announced Japan's surrender. But for Tanaka and thousands like him, the war had ended weeks ago, the moment they first tasted what their enemy ate while fighting them. The story of the Japanese POW and the American K ration begins not in prison camps, but in the fundamental philosophies that shaped 2 nations at war. For the soldiers of Imperial Japan, food was endurance made manifest. The Asaku Koryo, compressed rations, consisted of little more than dried rice, pickled plums, and a fragment of dried fish. A typical Japanese soldier's daily ration contained 1,200 calories when supplies were good, often dropping to half that when supply lines stretched thin across the Pacific's vast distances. This scarcity was not seen as weakness, but as spiritual strength. Hunger sharpened the warrior's edge, suffering purified the soul. The Japanese military diet reflected a culture built around gaman, enduring the seemingly unendurable. Officers ate the same meager rations as enlisted men, sometimes less. Rice mixed with barley to prevent beriberi became a luxury when barley ran out. Soldiers foraged for roots, leaves, anything edible on remote islands where supply ships no longer came. This was not failure. This was the way of the warrior, where material want created spiritual abundance. In striking contrast, American soldiers in the Pacific Theater carried what Japanese intelligence initially dismissed as impossible excess. The K ration, developed by physiologist Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota, delivered 2,830 calories across its 3 daily meals. Breakfast brought canned ham and eggs, hardtack biscuits, instant coffee, sugar, and chocolate. Lunch offered processed cheese, caramels, and powdered lemon drink. Dinner included meatloaf, bouillon, and more chocolate. Each day, an American infantryman consumed more protein than a Japanese soldier saw in a week. This abundance reflected America's industrial philosophy of war, where Japan sought victory through spiritual superiority and individual sacrifice. America pursued victory through material overwhelming. Factory production lines that once made automobiles now churned out millions of K rations monthly. By 1944, the peak year of production, American food manufacturers produced over 100 million K rations. The Cracker Jack Company, H.J. Heinz, and dozens of other civilian corporations had transformed their entire operations to feed a military that treated nutrition as a strategic weapon. Japanese military intelligence struggled to comprehend these reports. American ships carried ice cream barges, concrete vessels whose sole purpose was manufacturing frozen desserts for troop morale. The USS Lexington's crew reportedly scooped ice cream into their helmets while abandoning ship during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Such behavior seemed to confirm Japanese propaganda about American decadence and weakness. Yet this weakness was defeating Japanese most disciplined warriors. American industrial capacity could afford to waste more food daily than Japan could produce. Milk was discarded for being slightly warm. Chocolate bars cost 10 cents and came in 5 different varieties. Coca-Cola had established 64 bottling plants across the war zones, delivering 60 million cases to military personnel in 1943 alone. This was not decadence. This was industrial war fought with the casual confidence of material supremacy. The philosophical divide ran deeper than mere calories. Japanese soldiers were taught that Americans were soft, pleasure-seeking, individualistic people who would crumble when faced with true hardship. How could men who demanded ice cream in battle zones match the spiritual discipline of warriors who found strength in starvation? The answer would come not through combat, but through an even more profound challenge to Japanese understanding, the moment when the enemy offered food instead of death. By late 1944, the tide of war had shifted decisively, and for the first time in significant numbers, Japanese soldiers found themselves in American custody. The capture of Japanese troops had been rare in the early war years. The Bushido Code demanded death before dishonor, and most Japanese soldiers fought to the last bullet before taking their own lives. But as American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands, circumstances began overriding philosophy. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 left hundreds of sailors from sunken ships floating in the Pacific, too exhausted to choose death over rescue. The fall of Saipan brought the first large-scale captures of Japanese Army personnel. By 1945, American POW camps from California to Wisconsin housed over 5,000 Japanese prisoners, men who had crossed the ultimate line in their culture's military code. These prisoners expected execution or torture. Japanese military training had prepared them for American brutality, describing captivity as a fate worse than death. They had been told that Americans were racial inferiors who would subject Japanese to unspeakable humiliations. Death in battle was honorable. Survival in enemy hands was a stain that could never be cleansed. Instead, they encountered the Geneva Convention implemented with American efficiency. Upon arrival at camps like McCoy in Wisconsin or Clarinda in Iowa, Japanese POWs underwent medical examinations by doctors who treated their wounds and illnesses. They were issued clean uniforms, assigned barracks with real beds, and given work assignments that paid 80 cents a day, enough to purchase 16 Coca-Colas at the camp commissary. The contrast with their expectations was so jarring that many initially suspected elaborate psychological torture. The first meal became the first crack in their understanding of America. Where they expected starvation rations designed to break their spirit, they received K rations identical to what American soldiers ate in combat. The breakfast unit alone contained more nutrition than many had consumed in their final weeks of military service. Canned ham and eggs, hardtack biscuits, instant coffee with real sugar, chocolate bars that weren't ersatz substitutes made from pine bark and sawdust. For men who had survived on single rice balls per day during the desperate final battles of the Pacific War, the abundance was literally sickening. Many prisoners became violently ill during their first weeks in American custody, not from poor treatment, but from their digestive system's inability to process suddenly adequate nutrition. Camp doctors initially worried about poisoning before realizing they were witnessing the physiological shock of bodies adapting from starvation to abundance. The psychological impact proved even more profound than the physical. These men had been indoctrinated to believe that sacrifice and suffering were uniquely Japanese virtues that would overcome American material advantages. Discovering that their captors not only had superior equipment and numbers, but were actually better fed than Japanese soldiers, challenged fundamental assumptions about the war itself. American camp commanders, following military protocol, maintained detailed records of prisoner reactions. Reports describe Japanese POWs weeping after their first taste of ice cream, not from homesickness, but from the overwhelming realization of what American industrial capacity actually meant. If America could afford to serve ice cream to enemy prisoners, what did that say about Japan's chances of victory? If individual enemy soldiers ate better than Japanese officers, how vast was the material gap between the two nations? This knowledge would soon travel back to Japan itself, where it would shatter the illusions that had sustained the final year of desperate resistance.
Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura had not tasted chocolate in 3 years when the camp guard handed him his first K-ration dinner unit. The brown bar wrapped in wax paper felt impossibly dense in his fingers, not the sawdust and saccharin substitute that occasionally appeared in Japanese officer rations, but actual chocolate with real cocoa and sugar. He bit into it slowly, and the richness flooded his senses with memories of childhood, of a Japan before rationing, before the war economy had stripped away such luxuries even for civilians. Around him in the Camp Clorinda mess hall, other Japanese prisoners experienced their own moments of recognition. Chief Petty Officer Yamamoto discovered that American instant coffee was actual coffee beans, not the roasted acorn powder that had passed for coffee in the Imperial Navy's final months. Sergeant Ishida found real sugar, not the beetroot extract that had become Japan's wartime substitute, but crystalline sweetness that dissolved completely on his tongue. Each taste carried the weight of revelation. America was not rationing these luxuries. America was giving them away to enemy prisoners. The human cost of this abundance became clear in the prisoners' letters home, letters that American censors read but did not suppress. Nakamura wrote to his wife about gaining 12 pounds in his first month of captivity. Yamamoto described meals where food was left uneaten, a concept so foreign to Japanese experience that he struggled to find words for it. These were not letters of defeat, but of profound confusion about the nature of the enemy they had been fighting. Beyond the food itself lay the industrial achievement it represented. Each K-ration was a marvel of preservation and packaging technology that Japanese quartermasters could barely comprehend. The waxed cardboard boxes remained intact after months of storage. The canned meat showed no signs of spoilage after years in warehouses. The instant coffee dissolved completely in cold water, a convenience that Japanese military logistics had never achieved even with hot tea. Japanese prisoners working in camp kitchens observed American food preparation with the intensity of intelligence officers studying enemy fortifications. They watched tons of milk being poured out because it had reached its expiration date, milk that would have been a precious commodity, rationed by the ounce in wartime Japan.
They saw vegetables discarded for minor blemishes, meat rejected for slight discoloration, bread thrown away for being a day old. The waste was not carelessness, but abundance so complete that perfection became the minimum standard. The packaging itself told a story of industrial sophistication. Each K ration came with matches, cigarettes, toilet paper, and eating utensils. The attention to detail extended to comfort items, chewing gum to clean teeth, candy to boost morale, even paper napkins for cleanliness. These were not emergency rations cobbled together from whatever was available, but carefully engineered systems for maintaining soldier effectiveness. Japan's military had never achieved such systematic care for individual soldier welfare. Most devastating of all was the mathematical reality these K rations represented. Each prisoner received 3 meals daily without fail, regardless of weather, supply disruptions, or military operations. This reliability came from a supply chain so robust that it treated 2,830 calories per prisoner per day as a minor expense. Japanese logistics officers among the prisoners began calculating the implications with growing horror. If America could feed thousands of enemy prisoners better than Japan fed its active-duty soldiers, what did that suggest about overall American production capacity? The K rations alone required coordination between dozens of food processing companies, transportation networks spanning continents, and storage facilities in every theater of war. This was not military efficiency. This was industrial mobilization on a scale that dwarfed Japan's entire wartime economy. The cigarettes included in each K ration became symbols of this disparity. 4 cigarettes per meal, freely distributed to enemy prisoners, while Japanese soldiers often went months without tobacco. The mathematics were simple and brutal. America produced more tobacco for POW Aral than Japan could allocate to its entire military. The psychological impact extended beyond individual comfort to strategic understanding. These men began to grasp that they had not been fighting a military power, but an industrial civilization capable of sustaining global war as a secondary activity to its main economic functions. The commissary completed this education. Prisoners could purchase additional food, personal items, and luxuries using their work wages. The shelves stocked dozens of candy varieties, multiple brands of soft drinks, magazines, books, and personal care items. These abundance existed not in American homeland cities, but in remote prisoner-of-war camps housing enemy soldiers. The contrast with Japanese civilian rationing, where citizens received 1,793 calories per day by 1945, was so stark that many prisoners initially refused to believe the commissary prices were real. Ice cream cost the same for prisoners as for American civilians. Coca-Cola was universally available at the same 5-cent price charged in American drugstores. The revelation was complete. Japan had been fighting not just superior American military force, but superior American everything. These enemy prisoners were eating better than Japanese civilians, living in better conditions than Japanese soldiers, and being treated with more systematic care than Japan provided its own people. The implications would soon travel back to Japan itself, where they would contribute to the collapse of resistance in ways no military victory could achieve.
The deeper wound came, not from America's material abundance, but from the values it represented. Japanese military culture had built itself around the spiritual superiority born from material sacrifice. Bushido taught that suffering created strength, that want purified the soul, that luxury corrupted the warrior spirit. American abundance seemed to prove the opposite, that well-fed soldiers fought more effectively,
that comfortable troops maintained better morale, that material care enhanced rather than degraded military performance. Sergeant Major Takeshi Sato had led men through the hell of Guadalcanal, where Japanese forces survived on grass and tree bark while fighting American Marines who received hot meals and medical care. He had believed absolutely that Japanese spiritual discipline would overcome American material advantage. Now, confined in Camp McCoy, he watched American guards who were clearly well-fed, well-equipped, and well-trained, yet showed no signs of the weakness Japanese propaganda had promised would result from such comfort. The cultural collision intensified when prisoners observed American military routine. Guards ate the same K-rations as combat troops, but supplemented them with fresh food from the camp kitchen. Officers and enlisted men stood in the same meal lines, a violation of Japanese military hierarchy so fundamental that prisoners initially thought they were witnessing a breakdown in discipline. Instead, they observed a different model of military effectiveness, one that treated adequate nutrition as essential for all ranks, rather than a luxury reserved for senior officers. Japanese prisoners working in camp maintenance began to understand that American abundance was not accidental luxury, but systematic policy. Every aspect of camp life reflected deliberate care for human needs. Hot showers with unlimited soap, laundries that cleaned clothes to standards higher than Japanese civilian dress, medical care that treated minor ailments before they became serious problems. This was not weakness, but strength. A civilization so wealthy it could afford to care for enemy prisoners better than their own nation cared for loyal citizens. Among the Japanese prisoners were officers and senior non-commissioned officers who faced a crisis of understanding that went beyond personal comfort to professional competence. Colonel Masao Watanabe had graduated from the Imperial Military Academy believing in Japanese tactical and strategic superiority. Now, he calculated logistics with growing despair, realizing that Japanese military leadership had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their enemy. The mathematics of American abundance revealed strategic implications that no amount of spiritual discipline could overcome. If America could allocate 2,830 calories daily to thousands of enemy prisoners without apparent strain on supply systems, what did that suggest about American ability to sustain combat forces? Watanabe had commanded troops who fought effectively on 600 calories per day, but he now understood that this was necessity disguised as virtue. American soldiers fought just as effectively while consuming 4 times more food, and America could afford to feed them indefinitely. The officer corps among the prisoners began conducting informal analyses of American industrial capacity, using the K-rations as baseline data. The cigarettes alone suggested production capabilities that dwarfed Japanese estimates. 4 cigarettes per prisoner per day, multiplied by thousands of prisoners, multiplied by millions of American troops worldwide, suggested tobacco production at levels that exceeded Japanese entire agricultural output. This was not military procurement, but industrial mobilization on a scale that reduced Japan's war economy to insignificance. Senior prisoners also observed American military administration with professional interest and growing respect. The camps operated with efficiency that matched Japanese military standards, but included care for individual welfare that Japanese military culture considered unnecessary. Guards maintained discipline without brutality, administered regulations without corruption, and treated prisoners according to written standards rather than personal whim. This was not the undisciplined democracy Japanese propaganda had described, but systematic governance that achieved both effectiveness and humaneness. The most devastating impact was not material, but intellectual. The collapse of every assumption Japanese propaganda had built about American character and capability. Prisoners had been taught that Americans were individualistic cowards who would flee when faced with serious hardship. Instead, they encountered guards who maintained professional behavior even toward enemy soldiers, administrators who followed regulations even when personal bias might suggest otherwise, and a military system that functioned with mechanical precision while maintaining human decency. The ice cream became the perfect symbol of this propaganda collapse. Japanese intelligence had classified American ice cream production as top-secret information, not because it revealed military capabilities, but because it revealed the psychological impossibility of defeating a nation wealthy enough to manufacture frozen desserts for troop morale during active combat operations. When prisoners learned that ice cream was available at every meal, that ships existed solely to produce it, that Americans had literally scooped it into their helmets while abandoning sinking vessels, the implications destroyed every comfortable assumption about enemy weakness. The letters home began carrying messages that Japanese censors found impossible to suppress without appearing weak themselves. Prisoners wrote about abundance so complete that food was thrown away, about medical care that exceeded Japanese civilian standards, about work assignments that paid enemy soldiers enough to purchase luxuries unavailable to Japanese civilians. These were not letters of defeat, but of discovery. The discovery that Japan had been fighting an enemy whose casual abundance exceeded Japanese maximum effort. The most devastating impact was not material, but intellectual. The collapse of every assumption Japanese propaganda had built about American character and capability. Prisoners had been taught that Americans were individualistic cowards who would flee when faced with serious hardship. Instead, they encountered guards who maintained professional behavior even toward enemy soldiers, administrators who followed regulations even when personal bias might suggest otherwise, and a military system that functioned with mechanical precision while maintaining human decency. The high-quality food, medical care, and abundance of supplies provided to Japanese prisoners demonstrated an offensive material gap that shattered Japanese propaganda. The letters home became carrying the message that Japanese censors found impossible to suppress without appearing weak themselves. Prisoners wrote about abundance so complete that food was thrown away, about medical care that exceeded Japanese civilian standards, about work assignments that paid enemy soldiers enough to purchase luxuries unavailable to Japanese civilians. These were not letters of defeat, but of discovery. The discovery that Japan had been fighting an enemy whose casual abundance exceeded Japanese maximum effort.
Most psychologically devastating was the realization that American kindness was not weakness, but strength. Guards who shared cigarettes with prisoners, doctors who treated enemy wounded with the same care given to American soldiers, and administrators who processed complaints according to written procedures rather than arbitrary authority. This was not the corruption Japanese propaganda had promised, but systematic decency backed by unlimited resources. America could afford to be generous with enemy prisoners because America could afford anything. The prisoners began to understand that Japanese sacrifice had been noble but futile, not because Japanese courage was insufficient, but because Japanese industrial capacity was inadequate. They had brought spiritual weapons to an industrial war, and while their spirit remained unbroken, their understanding of victory became impossible to maintain. The K rations had taught them the most devastating lesson of all. They had never been fighting America, but only a small fraction of American capability. And even that fraction had been sufficient to ensure Japan's defeat. The moment of absolute realization came not during interrogation or propaganda sessions, but during an ordinary afternoon in September 1945, when the full implications of American abundance finally crystallized into unavoidable truth. Captain Jiro Matsumoto sat in the Camp McCoy Library, a facility that existed for enemy prisoners in wartime America. He had been studying English since his capture 3 months earlier, partly from boredom, partly from a growing need to understand the civilization that had defeated his nation so completely. Today, he held a copy of Life magazine dated August 15, 1945, the day Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The magazine's pages revealed another America entirely, one that existed beyond the military might that had crushed Japanese resistance. Photographs showed American civilians eating meals that exceeded Japanese military officer rations. Advertisements promoted automobiles, household appliances, and consumer goods that represented individual wealth greater than entire Japanese villages possessed. Children's birthday parties displayed cakes and ice cream that would have fed a Japanese infantry squad for days. Matsumoto turned each page with growing comprehension of the impossible scale of his nation's miscalculation. This was not a military-industrial complex stretched to wartime limits, but a consumer economy casually redirected to military production. America had been fighting World War II as a secondary activity, while maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded Japanese peacetime prosperity. The K rations he consumed daily were not America's maximum effort, but America's minimum standard for keeping enemy prisoners adequately fed. The numbers began falling into place with mathematical inevitability. If American prisoners ate 2,830 calories daily, while American civilians maintained rationing-free diets, what did that suggest about total American food production? If individual American families owned automobiles, while Japan's entire civilian transportation relied on bicycles and streetcars, what did that indicate about steel and rubber production? If American children had birthday parties with multiple flavors of ice cream, while Japanese civilians received 1,793 calories daily of rice and vegetables, what did that reveal about the true balance of industrial power? Around him in the library, other Japanese prisoners conducted their own reckonings with reality. Lieutenant Hashimoto compared American automobile advertisements with his memories of Tokyo, where private car ownership had been virtually eliminated to conserve resources for military production. Sergeant Tanaka studied photographs of American grocery stores, trying to comprehend shelves stocked with dozens of varieties of canned goods, fresh produce, and packaged foods that represented abundance beyond Japanese imagination. The most devastating revelation came through understanding American casualness about waste. The Life magazine articles mentioned rationing as a minor inconvenience rather than desperate necessity. Americans complained about limited sugar for home baking, while Japanese soldiers had not seen real sugar in years. American children discarded partially eaten candy bars, while Japanese civilians treasured single pieces of hard candy as precious luxuries. This was not efficiency versus waste, but abundance so complete that conservation seemed unnecessary. The prisoners began calculating backwards from the evidence of their own treatment to the vast industrial base that made such treatment possible. Each K ration required coordination between farms producing ingredients, factories processing foods, packaging plants creating containers, transportation networks moving supplies, and storage facilities maintaining inventory. The casual efficiency with which thousands of K rations appeared daily in POW camps suggested supply chains so robust they treated feeding enemy prisoners as a minor logistical detail. Matsumoto had been a logistics officer before his capture. He began sketching calculations in his notebook. If America produced over 100 million K rations in 1944 while maintaining civilian food abundance, what did that suggest about agricultural productivity? If American factories could shift from producing automobiles to manufacturing military equipment without apparent strain, what did that indicate about industrial flexibility? If America could establish ice cream production facilities on remote Pacific islands while Japan struggled to deliver rice to frontline troops, what did that reveal about transportation capabilities? The mathematics painted a picture of industrial capacity so vast that Japanese resistance had not just been futile, but mathematically impossible. Japan's entire wartime economy, every factory converted to military production, every civilian sacrifice, every resource mobilized for total war, had been competing against a fraction of American industrial potential. America had won the Pacific War while producing consumer goods, maintaining civilian living standards, and feeding enemy prisoners better than Japan fed its active-duty soldiers. The psychological impact was complete and irreversible. These men had not been defeated by superior Japanese forces, but by industrial civilization operating at a scale that rendered Japanese military virtues obsolete. Courage, discipline, and spiritual dedication remained admirable, but they could not overcome an enemy capable of casual abundance during global warfare. The K rations had taught them that they had been fighting not a military campaign, but an industrial demonstration, and the demonstration was over. The psychological warfare of kindness was more devastating than any form of cruelty Japanese propaganda had prepared them to resist. In October 1945, as autumn touched the Wisconsin landscape around Camp McCoy, the final psychological demolition occurred through an act of almost casual American generosity. The camp commander announced that Japanese prisoners could write unlimited letters home, with American authorities providing paper, envelopes, and postage free of charge. This was not an interrogation technique or propaganda operation, but simple adherence to Geneva Convention requirements, America treating enemy prisoners according to written standards rather than emotional impulses. For Lieutenant Colonel Hideki Yamashita, the offer represented a challenge more profound than any battlefield decision he had faced. What could he tell his family about his experience in enemy captivity? How could he describe abundance so complete that prisoners gained weight while Japanese civilians starved? How could he explain that American guards shared cigarettes with enemy soldiers while Japanese troops went months without tobacco? Yamashita began writing, then stopped, then began again. Each sentence carried implications that challenged everything his family believed about the war, about Japan's enemies, about the prospects for victory that had already been decided by surrender. He wrote about medical care that exceeded Japanese civilian hospitals, about work assignments that paid enemy prisoners enough to purchase luxuries, about food so abundant that portions were left uneaten. Each fact was true, verifiable, and devastating to Japanese understanding of American weakness. The letters would travel back to a Japan devastated by bombing, starvation, and industrial collapse. Japanese families surviving on 1,200 calories daily would read about their captured sons gaining weight in enemy prison camps. Wives rationing single cigarettes over weeks would learn about husbands receiving 4 cigarettes daily as enemy prisoners. Parents selling possessions to purchase black market rice would discover their children eating American chocolate as routine prison fare. The prisoners began to grasp that their individual experiences represented systematic American policy rather than exceptional treatment. Through conversations with guards and staff members, they learned that similar conditions existed in dozens of POW camps across America. This was not propaganda designed to impress a few captured officers, but standard operating procedure for handling thousands of enemy prisoners according to written standards applied uniformly across the American military system. The systematic nature of American abundance proved more psychologically devastating than any individual luxury. Each K-ration represented not exceptional generosity, but routine logistics. Each comfortable barracks reflected not special treatment, but minimum standards. Each medical examination demonstrated not propaganda kindness, but institutional policy. America treated enemy prisoners well, not from emotional generosity, but from industrial capability so vast that adequate care cost
less than adequate care. Staff Sergeant Keisuke Morimura had commanded supply operations for an entire Japanese regiment. He began interviewing other prisoners about their camp experiences, comparing conditions, seeking variations that might suggest weakness or strain in American supply systems. Instead, he discovered uniformity that suggested unlimited capability. Camps in California, Texas, Wisconsin, and Iowa all maintained identical standards. Prisoners captured in 1943 reported the same treatment as those captured in 1945. American abundance was not temporary wartime achievement, but permanent industrial capacity. The most devastating discovery came through understanding American civilian conditions during the war. Guards mentioned rationing as minor inconvenience, limited sugar for baking, restricted gasoline for pleasure driving, reduced variety in consumer goods. These hardships exceeded Japanese peacetime living standards. American civilians had experienced wartime sacrifice as mild inconvenience, while Japanese civilians had endured wartime sacrifice as near starvation. The gap between American difficulty and Japanese desperation revealed the true scale of industrial disparity.
By late 1945, the mathematical reality had become inescapable. Japan had mobilized every resource, converted every factory, sacrificed every luxury, and rationed every necessity to achieve total war production, and had been defeated by an America that maintained civilian abundance while supporting global military operations. The K-rations were merely the most visible symbol of industrial capacity so vast that adequately feeding millions of soldiers and thousands of enemy prisoners represented a minor allocation of available resources. The prisoners began writing letters that would reach Japan as the occupation began. Letters that would contribute to Japanese acceptance of defeat as not just military necessity, but mathematical inevitability. They wrote about abundance beyond imagination, about systematic kindness backed by unlimited resources, about industrial civilization operating at scales that reduced Japanese maximum effort to statistical insignificance.
These letters would reach families preparing for American occupation with expectations shaped by Japanese military behavior in occupied territories. Instead of describing brutality, starvation, and systematic humiliation, the letters described medical care, adequate food, and treatment according to written laws rather than arbitrary authority. The contrast between expectation and reality would ease Japanese civilian acceptance of occupation, while simultaneously demonstrating the complete impossibility of continued resistance. The psychological warfare was complete, not through cruelty, but through kindness, not through deprivation, but through abundance, not through breaking spirits, but through opening minds to realities too vast for previous comprehension. The K-rations had delivered their message. Japan had not been fighting an enemy, but an industrial civilization. And the war had been decided not by military tactics, but by productive capacity that rendered Japanese resistance mathematically impossible. The turning point was complete. These men understood that they had participated not in military defeat, but in industrial education, and the lesson would travel back to Japan itself as the foundation for rebuilding a nation that had finally grasped the true nature of modern war.
The reports filtering back to Japan carried implications that Japanese leadership found impossible to suppress or deny. As American censors processed thousands of letters from Japanese POWs to their families, they encountered a phenomenon unprecedented in military history: enemy soldiers voluntarily providing detailed intelligence about American industrial capacity through descriptions of their treatment as prisoners. These letters, written by men desperate to reassure families about their survival, inadvertently delivered the most devastating assessment of Japanese strategic position that any intelligence service could have compiled. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze strategy, had classified ice cream production aboard American ships as top secret precisely because he understood its psychological implications. If American forces could manufacture frozen desserts during combat operations, what did that suggest about the industrial base supporting such luxuries? Now, detailed letters from prisoners described ice cream served daily in POW camps, along with chocolate, coffee, fresh vegetables, and medical care that exceeded Japanese civilian standards. Japanese military censors faced an impossible choice: suppress letters that provided desperate families with news of captured relatives, or allow circulation of information that demonstrated the mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory. They chose compromise, editing letters to remove specific details about American abundance while preserving personal messages. But even edited versions carried implications that no censorship could eliminate. Captured Japanese soldiers were surviving, gaining weight, and receiving treatment that contradicted every propaganda claim about American brutality. The letters reached a Japan experiencing systematic collapse of civilian infrastructure. By late 1945, Japanese cities lay in ruins from incendiary bombing, transportation networks had broken down completely, and civilian rations had dropped to starvation levels. Families reading about sons gaining weight in American captivity began calculating the obvious implications. Enemy prisoners were eating better than loyal Japanese citizens. The leadership response. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement on August 15, 1945, had cited a new and most cruel bomb as justification for ending the war. But intelligence reports from prisoner correspondents revealed crueler weapons: systematic kindness backed by unlimited resources.
Japanese leadership began understanding that atomic weapons had merely accelerated an inevitable conclusion already determined by industrial disparity so vast that continued resistance was mathematically impossible. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, had advocated fighting to the death rather than accepting occupation. Reports from prisoner camps describing American treatment of prisoners according to written laws rather than arbitrary authority suggested that occupation might follow similar patterns. If America treated enemy soldiers with systematic decency, what did that suggest about treatment of occupied populations? The contrast with Japanese behavior in occupied territories created expectations that eased Japanese acceptance of defeat. The most devastating revelation came through understanding American casualness about the abundance described in prisoner letters. Guards sharing cigarettes with enemy prisoners, doctors providing medical care exceeding Japanese civilian standards, and administrators processing complaints according to written procedures. These were not propaganda operations, but routine behavior, reflecting systematic policies. America's treatment of Japanese prisoners demonstrated not exceptional generosity, but normal operations of industrial civilization operating with unlimited resources. Japanese military leadership began comprehending that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their enemy. American military effectiveness had not resulted from superior tactics or strategy, but from industrial capacity so vast that adequate equipment, supplies, and care represented minor allocations of available resources. Japanese soldiers had fought effectively despite material disadvantages, but American soldiers had fought just as effectively while enjoying material advantages so complete they extended to adequate care for enemy prisoners. The Industrial Reckoning. Staff calculations based on prisoner reports revealed the true scale of Japanese strategic miscalculation. If America could allocate 2,830 calories daily to thousands of enemy prisoners without apparent strain, what did that suggest about total American food production? If American POW camps maintained medical facilities exceeding Japanese civilian hospitals, what did that indicate about American healthcare capacity? If American guards earned enough to purchase luxuries while Japanese officers went without necessities, what did that reveal about comparative economic productivity? The mathematics painted a picture of industrial disparity so vast that Japanese resistance had never been strategically viable. Japan's total economic mobilization, every factory converted to military production, every civilian sacrifice, every resource dedicated to total war, had been competing against a fraction of American industrial potential. America had won the Pacific War while maintaining civilian abundance, supporting global military operations, and treating enemy prisoners better than Japan treated its own soldiers. Intelligence officers studying prisoner correspondence began calculating backwards from individual treatment to systematic capabilities. Each K ration reflected supply chains coordinating dozens of food processors, transportation networks spanning continents, and storage facilities maintaining inventory for global distribution. The casual efficiency with which American forces provided adequate nutrition to prisoners suggested logistics capabilities that reduced Japanese supply problems to amateur incompetence. The prisoner letters also revealed American military culture fundamentally different from Japanese expectations. Guards who maintained professional behavior toward enemy soldiers, officers who followed written regulations rather than personal authority, and administrators who treated prisoners according to systematic policies. This was not the undisciplined democracy Japanese propaganda had described, but systematic governance achieving both effectiveness and humaneness. By December 1945, as American occupation forces arrived in Japan, Japanese leadership understood that they faced not military conquest, but industrial education. The prisoner letters had prepared Japanese civilians for occupation by forces capable of systematic abundance rather than systematic brutality. The K rations had delivered their final message. Japan was about to learn directly what their captured soldiers had discovered through 3 meals daily, that they had been fighting not an enemy, but an industrial civilization, and that civilization was about to demonstrate its capabilities through rebuilding rather than revenge.
The broader implications extended far beyond individual prisoner experiences to reshape Japanese understanding of modern warfare and industrial civilization. As 1946 dawned over a devastated Japan, the lessons learned in American POW camps began influencing reconstruction efforts with unexpected consequences. Japanese engineers and administrators who had been captured during the war's final stages returned home carrying more than just memories of adequate food and humane treatment. They brought detailed observations of American industrial organization, administrative efficiency, and systematic approach to problem solving that would revolutionize Japanese rebuilding efforts. Former Lieutenant Colonel Yamashita, who had calculated American industrial capacity from his daily K rations, found himself appointed to Tokyo's Reconstruction Planning Committee. His wartime observations of American logistics translated directly into understanding how to organize large-scale civilian relief operations. The systematic approach he had witnessed in POW camp administration, written procedures, consistent standards, and care for individual welfare became templates for reorganizing Japanese government services devastated by war. The psychological impact proved equally transformative. Japanese civilians who had prepared for occupation expecting brutality based on Japanese behavior in occupied territories, instead encountered American forces who distributed food aid with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized POW camp operations. The contrast between expectation and reality eased Japanese acceptance of occupation, while demonstrating that American abundance was not wartime exception, but permanent industrial capability. The economic revelation. American food aid operations in 1946 delivered the final demonstration of industrial capacity that prisoner letters had only suggested. Operation Garioa, or Government and Relief in Occupied Areas, brought millions of tons of food supplies to prevent mass starvation in defeated Japan. The scale of these operations dwarfed Japan's total wartime production, yet represented only a minor allocation of American agricultural output. Japanese officials administering relief distribution calculated that America was providing more food aid to defeated enemies than Japan had been able to produce for loyal citizens during the war's peak years. The systematic nature of American relief operations revealed organizational capabilities that exceeded Japanese understanding of possible efficiency. American forces established supply networks reaching every prefecture, distribution centers serving every major city, and inventory systems tracking millions of individual rations. This was not military occupation, but industrial demonstration. America casually accomplishing in occupied territory what Japan had failed to achieve on its home islands during total war mobilization. Japanese economists studying American aid operations began comprehending the mathematical relationship between industrial capacity and military capability that their wartime leadership had fatally misunderstood. America's ability to feed defeated Japan while supporting global military commitments
suggested productive capacity so vast that the Pacific War had represented only partial utilization of available resources. Japan had brought maximum effort to contest America's secondary attention, and the outcome had been mathematically predetermined. The cultural transformation. The deeper impact extended beyond economics to fundamental understanding of the relationship between material abundance and social organization. Japanese observers noted that American forces maintained discipline and effectiveness while enjoying living standards that exceeded Japanese peacetime prosperity. This contradicted core assumptions of Japanese military culture about the relationship between hardship and strength, suggesting that adequate material conditions enhanced rather than degraded human performance. Former prisoners returning to Japan brought detailed observations of American military organization that challenged traditional Japanese hierarchies. They described officers and enlisted personnel eating similar food, using similar facilities, and following written procedures rather than arbitrary authority based on rank. This systematic equality, backed by unlimited resources, had produced military effectiveness that exceeded Japanese performance, despite Japanese emphasis on rigid hierarchy and individual sacrifice. The transformation accelerated as American occupation policies demonstrated the same systematic care for civilian welfare that prisoners had experienced in POW camps. Instead of exploitation designed to extract maximum resources, American administrators implemented programs designed to rebuild Japanese industrial capacity. The Marshall Plan approach to occupied territories, treating former enemies as future partners rather than permanent subjects, reflected the same industrial abundance that had made adequate prisoner care a routine rather than exceptional policy. The strategic legacy. By 1947, Japanese understanding of modern warfare had been completely revolutionized through lessons learned from K-rations and their implications. Military planners studying future defense needs began with industrial capacity rather than traditional military virtues, recognizing that modern war required productive capacity to sustain advanced equipment, adequate supplies, and systematic care for personnel. The spiritual factors that had dominated Japanese military thinking remained important, but were now understood as enhancements to, rather than substitutes for, material capability. The prisoner experience had taught Japanese leadership that American victory had resulted not from superior tactics or strategy, but from industrial civilization operating at scales that rendered traditional military calculations obsolete. This understanding influenced Japanese post-war development policies, emphasizing industrial growth and technological advancement as foundations for national security, rather than relying on military traditions developed for pre-industrial warfare. The K-rations had delivered their final lesson. Modern warfare was industrial competition, in which military operations represented only the final stage of productive capacity applied to organized violence. Nations that could afford to treat enemy prisoners with systematic generosity could afford any level of military expenditure necessary to ensure victory. Japan's post-war recovery would be built on this understanding, transforming a nation that had learned the hard way that industrial capacity determined not just military outcomes, but the fundamental character of civilization itself. The men who had tasted American K-rations for 30 days had questioned everything they believed, and in questioning had discovered truths that would reshape Japan's understanding of its place in the modern world. Their experience became the foundation for a new Japan that would never again mistake spiritual dedication for industrial capability or individual sacrifice for systematic abundance.
In the end, the story of Japanese POWs and American K-rations reveals a profound truth about the nature of modern warfare and human civilization. The cardboard boxes that once contained ham and eggs, coffee and chocolate, became symbols of something far greater than military logistics. They represented the collision between two fundamentally different philosophies of human organization, one that sought strength through sacrifice, another that found strength through abundance. The Japanese prisoners who consumed 2,830 calories daily while their countrymen survived on 1,200 had witnessed not just military defeat, but the demonstration of industrial civilization operating at scales that rendered traditional concepts of warfare obsolete. What happened in those POW camps between 1944 and 1945 was psychological warfare in its purest form. Not the breaking of enemy spirits through cruelty, but the opening of enemy minds through kindness backed by unlimited resources. Each K-ration delivered a message more devastating than any propaganda. America had not been fighting at maximum capacity, but had been operating with such casual abundance that adequate care for enemy prisoners represented a minor administrative detail rather than strategic burden. The broader implications extended far beyond World War II to illuminate the fundamental character of modern conflict. Wars between industrial civilizations are decided not by courage, tactics, or individual sacrifice, though these remain important, but by productive capacity applied to organized violence. The Japanese prisoners learned that spiritual dedication without industrial support became noble futility, while industrial capability provided the foundation for both military effectiveness and humane treatment of enemies. Their experience prefigured the Cold War dynamics that would dominate the following decades, where ideological competition was ultimately decided by economic productivity rather than military confrontation. The Soviet Union would eventually face the same mathematical reality that had confronted Imperial Japan. Revolutionary fervor and individual sacrifice could not compensate for systematic disadvantage in industrial capacity and technological innovation. The K-rations taught their final lesson about the relationship between abundance and power in modern civilization. Nations that could afford systematic generosity toward their own citizens, their allies, and even their enemies possessed not weakness but ultimate strength. The casual efficiency with which America provided adequate nutrition to thousands of enemy prisoners while maintaining global military operations demonstrated industrial maturity that reduced purely military considerations to secondary importance. Today, as we confront new forms of global competition and conflict, the story of Japanese POWs tasting American K-rations reminds us that the most devastating weapons are often the most humane ones. The systematic kindness that challenged everything those prisoners believed about their enemy proved more psychologically effective than any form of cruelty could have achieved. In questioning their assumptions about American weakness, they discovered the industrial strength that would reshape the post-war world, and learned that true power lies not in the ability to inflict suffering, but in the capacity to eliminate it through systematic abundance guided by humane values. The empty K-ration boxes they carried home became artifacts of transformation, not just personal conversion from enemy to understanding,
but historical transition from traditional warfare based on individual heroism to modern conflict determined by collective productivity. In 30 days of adequate meals, they had witnessed the future of human civilization, the triumph of systematic care over noble sacrifice, industrial capability over spiritual dedication, and organized abundance over dignified scarcity.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into how food, war, and material power shaped history, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps us uncover more forgotten stories. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next historical breakdown. And if you know someone who'd love this fascinating look at America's secret weapon, share this video with them. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next chapter of history.